All right, let's do this first of the substitute lectures. I'm going to try this format and see if it works for you guys. The last major phylum or superphylum that we're going to look at is called the Ecdysozoa. Ecdysis is Greek for molting. So Ecdysozoa are the molting animals, those that shed their skins. And what they share in common is a cuticle that contains at least some chitin, carbohydrate polymer, and that cuticle is periodically shed. It's molted. Usually it's shed only a fixed number of times under the control of specialized hormones called ecdysteroids. And a word that we'll be using is that life cycle stages in between these molts are called instars. So we can talk about a larval instar of such and such a species or something like that. The cilia, if they're even present, they're never external. There's no cilia on the outside of the body, unlike flatworms, for example. They're never used for locomotion. Usually they don't even have them. I think there are some roundworms that have traces of cilia internally, but there's never any externally. There's no flagella on the sperm. The sperm are little amoebas, and that means that ecdysozoans typically have to copulate in order to get sperm to the egg, because the sperm can't just swim around until they find an egg, as you'd find in, quite a lot of organisms. The sperm have to be brought to the egg. And finally, there's similarities in DNA sequences, and this was the basis for establishing this grouping back in a paper that came out in '97. And there's a bunch of phyla, but the two big ones are the arthropods, which is insects and crustaceans and arachnids and things like that, and the nematodes. And there's a ecdysozoan's remains. That's the molted exoskeleton of a New Zealand cicada. You've seen similar exoskeletons around here in Arkansas during the summer, and maybe stuck them on your nose to freak out your little sister, or at least that's what I used to do with them. And the nematode is one of the big parasite success stories, but there's a ridiculous number of free living species as well. About 28,000 species known. Probably that's maybe a tenth of what's really out there. They're so abundant that it's been somebody calculated that 4 out of 5 individual animals on Earth are nematodes. You find them in fresh waters, in mud, in soil, very common in soil, in compost. You find them in the oceans, from the shallows all the way to the depths, from the equator to the poles. They're everywhere. And just about every animal or plant can be parasitized by nematodes. Human parasites include everything from pinworm to hookworm to guinea worm to elephantiasis. Animal parasites include cat arrowhead worms. Heartworm is probably the biggest one around here, certainly the best known. Plant parasites do $100 billion of damage annually to agriculture. They can damage any crop. They can also damage things that you might not think of. I had a student once who worked at one of the golf courses in town, and nematodes were the bane of his existence because they'd make these dead patches on the fairways and greens. So that was expensive to try to control. But there are even some parasites that are used in what's called integrated pest management to try to control other pests. And you'll see some of those as we go. The nematologist Nathan Cobb said about 120 years ago that the nematodes, poor beasts, do not furnish hides, horns, tallow, or wool. They are not fit for food, nor do they produce anything fit for food. Neither do they sing or amuse us in any way, nor are they ornamental. In fact, when they are displayed in museums, the public votes them hideous. But they are extremely worth study because they are so abundant. Cobb went on to point out that if you could sweep away all of the matter in the universe except the nematodes, you could still recognize the Earth. And if you could come back as a ghost and explore, we should find its mountains, hills, vales, rivers, lakes, and oceans represented by a film of nematodes. The location of towns would be decipherable, since for every massing of human beings, there would be a corresponding massing of certain nematodes. Trees would still stand in ghostly rows. The location of the various plants and animals would still be decipherable. And had we sufficient knowledge, in many cases even their species could be determined by an examination of their erstwhile nematode parasites. Everything is basically made of freaking nematodes. So what do these look like? Free-living nematodes are typically quite small. They range somewhere between microscopic and maybe just a couple of millimeters in length. We usually can't study them without the microscope. Parasites can get bigger. Ascaris, the human intestinal nematode, can get up to something like 5 or 6 inches or 12 to 15 centimeters. And there are some that get even bigger. I can't imagine this one's ever been studied very often, but there is a species that parasitizes sperm whale placentas, and females of that species can get up to 25 feet. So the parasites can get quite a bit larger, but free-living ones tend to be microscopic. There's a spacious body cavity filled with fluid. For technical reasons that we don't need to get into here, that cavity is sometimes called a pseudocoel because it isn't lined with the same type of tissue that a true coelom is, but I'm not going to say much about that here. The body has 4 bands of longitudinal muscles, but it hasn't got any circular muscles, which means longitudinal means running from head to tail. So when a nematode contracts one of those muscles, it bends to that side. And so nematodes can thrash side to side and bend into S curves and C curves, looking a little bit like Axl Rose in the video for Sweet Child of Mine. Not that you post-millennials appreciate good music when you hear it. So they can't burrow the way that a burrowing earthworm, for example, could, because they can't make any part of their body more or less narrow. They have to push sideways against whatever they're burrowing through, and that lashing back and forth movement is very distinctive. As typical for ecdysozoans, there are no functional cilia in or out of the body. Nematodes feed by suction. There is a pharynx that has 3 bundles of muscle arranged around its inside, meaning that in cross-section it looks like the Mercedes logo. The open space is shaped like a 3-point star. There's a nervous system with a nerve ring and 4 main nerve cords, and the tail extends past the anus. I'll leave you for the moment with a picture of the best-known nematode, one that's found in soil called Caenorhabditis elegans, where you can see the basic features. And we'll talk about these on the next presentation.